Thanks everyone for joining today. We're seeing a lot of interest in these topics, so we appreciate you taking the time. My name is Patrick Mullen. I'll kick things off and then turn it over to our panel. This session is being recorded and we'll share the recording afterwards. We'll also leave time for questions and we encourage participation throughout, especially since this session is eligible for IACCP continuing education credit and potentially other credits. We're focused on a simple but important question. If rulemaking slows, where will enforcement actually intensify? And what does that mean in practice for how firms operate day to day? And more importantly, what should firms be doing now to make sure they're prepared? I'm pleased to be joined by a great panel. Jamila Mayfield is our Chief Regulatory Services Officer here at Comply. Jamila is a former regulator and works closely with firms on SEC examinations and enforcement trends. Med Dano is our SVP of Compliance Advisory Services here at Comply. He works directly with firms on operational implementation, surveillance programs, and regulatory readiness. And Gail Bernstein, General Counsel at the Investment Advisor Association, leads legal and policy efforts on behalf of the industry and brings a broad perspective on regulatory developments impacting investment advisors. With that, I'll turn it over to Jamila to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Pat. And again, as you said, welcome to everyone joining us today. We have a packed agenda, a lot to cover. We'll start with talking about enforcement and what's really shifting from an enforcement priorities perspective. We'll move into artificial intelligence, the topic everybody's talking about and what it means for compliance. Then we'll dive into Reg SP. We've been chatting about this one for quite some time and coming up on an important June date. We'll talk about what that means. And then the marketing rule, it is not going away. We've gotten more insights from the latest risk alert, so we'll hear more about what that means for the industry as well. Finally, we'll talk about what is important for compliance leaders to be thinking about. How should they prioritize? And we'll get Med and Gail's perspective on that. So without further ado, we'll go forward. And enforcement in 2026, what is really shifting? Gail, I'd love you to give us some perspective on how you see the enforcement agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Jamila, and thank you very much to Comply for having me again, speaking to everybody. What we are seeing right now is a real attempt to reset following the Chair Gary Gensler era. I think what I would want to emphasize is that this is not about deregulation, it is about recalibration. For anybody who thinks that we are entering into or in anything like the Wild West, we are nowhere close to the Wild West, and that is not the intent of this SEC. It is not the intent of this SEC not to continue to have enforcement as a core sort of principle of what it does. So again, deregulation does not mean reduced scrutiny. It's different, but not in any way diminished. And this does also not mean a retreat from bread and butter enforcement. I think what we're seeing is that the focus is different. The question for advisors is, what is the SEC going to choose to enforce and how, rather than whether? So Chairman Atkins has talked about getting back to basics, not regulating through enforcement, which has been very important to us, and going after misconduct and situations where there has been or is likely to be investor harm. Just to underscore that point, the IAA recently had our annual conference and Commissioner Mark Ueda spoke there, and he made the point at the IAA conference that a strong enforcement program remains central to the SEC mission, and I think we're seeing that. So before I get into some of the substantive priorities and areas of focus, it's worth noting a few major developments, structural developments inside the Division of Enforcement itself over the past year. I think what we're seeing internally is also driving what we're seeing externally. So some statistics. Enforcement activity is down and it's more focused. The division published its 2025 fiscal year statistics quite recently, and they really tell a story. In 2025, there were 456 total actions, down from 583 in 2024. Of these, there were 303 standalone cases, down from 431, which is about a 70% drop, and the lowest level that we've seen in a decade. In terms of what penalties the Commission collected, we saw in 2025 $17.9 billion in monetary relief collected, but that number is really misleading because it was heavily driven by some legacy cases and one in particular. So if you strip out the legacy cases, you're closer to 2.7 billion in real penalties, which is about a 70% drop from the year before. So the trend in numbers is pretty clear. We're seeing fewer cases. We are seeing less reliance on broad sweeps, and we're seeing more targeted enforcement. So if we work under the sort of assumption that resources to a degree are shaping strategy, the SEC also just put in a budget proposal, and it has asked for about 11% less than what it asked for last year. It asked for about $1.9 billion total. And so enforcement funding remains well below prior peak levels. And at the same time, given the sort of attrition for various reasons that we saw over the course of 2025, the enforcement staffing is down close to about 20%, sorry. So the practical effect is that the division and the commission have to be more selective in the cases that they're going to bring. So there has to be a higher bar for what they're willing to investigate and pursue. And they also are going to want to see a greater focus on clear and provable violations with either investor harm or likelihood of investor harm. The division has also seen leadership and policy shifts. There's been significant leadership turnover. Just recently, Judge Margaret Ryan, who was the most recent enforcement director, she was brought in last fall. She left after about 6 months. And Chairman Atkins has now named David Woodcock as the new director. He's not going to start until May 4th. And so the acting director, who was actually acting before Judge Ryan came on board, Sam Walden, is going to be leading in the interim. David Woodcock he's got an interesting background. He brings very deep experience, including deep SEC experience as the former Fort Worth regional director. He has a background in traditional enforcement and litigation. His experience focuses primarily on more on the public company space. So it'll be interesting to see if we see an uptick of actions there. And he also has academic and private practice experience. And then with respect to policy directions, Chairman Atkins has been very clear about what he wants to see. He has said that the Division of Enforcement has undergone a significant course correction, restoring congressional intent by prioritizing cases that provide meaningful investor protection and strengthen market integrity. So what does this mean for what the division is pulling back from? We're seeing a shift away from crypto enforcement cases, including dismissals of very high-profile matters. We are seeing I think a stop really in off-channel communications cases. And this, when I talked about we're going to see fewer broad sweeps, this is really what I had in mind. These off-channel communications were resource intensive for the Commission. They were viewed largely as penalty driven rather than substantively driven. And they were largely without claims of investor harm. I think it's fair to say that we all expect that we will not see cases like this under this administration. We're also unlikely to see aggressive or novel legal theories, particularly where courts have shown skepticism. So one example is obviously in the crypto space. Another example is where there have been novel insider trading, like shadow insider trading theories pushed by the SEC. More broadly, and this is a very welcome development, we're hoping to see and expect to see less policy making through enforcement and less experimentation. We are also likely to see more effort to resolve things at the exam level rather than at the referral to enforcement level. So I think we're going to see more requests and push for remediation by exams and fewer referrals to the enforcement division. So I've talked about what we won't see. So what will we see? What replaces all of this? As I said, it's going to be back to basics. We're seeing a return to bread and butter enforcement. This commission is going to focus on fraud, misappropriation, fiduciary duty violations, both duty of loyalty and duty of care, clear conflicts of interest violations, and very importantly, retail investor harm. We're also going to see a focus on more individual accountability cases, which doesn't translate into more CCO liability or more potential CCO liability. I think that the standards for when a CCO is going to be looked at as to whether or not he or she should be held personally liable, those standards will, I think, stay the same. They're going to be looking for some direct involvement or really, really bad not paying attention to what's going on at the firm. We are also going to see more straightforward and fact-driven matters, so fewer theory-driven cases and more fact pattern cases. This is definitely much closer to what IAA members have been advocating for. We've wanted to see a focus on misconduct and investor harm and not just on technical footfalls. We've seen a lot in the past, pre-2025, a focus on technical footfalls, and we think that that's unfortunate. It's not the best use of enforcement's resources. We are hoping to see, and this is consistent with sort of what we've been pushing for, greater predictability in what goes to enforcement and much less reliance on enforcement to set policy. We're hoping that policy really comes out of the policy divisions, like the Division of Investment Management, with input from enforcement, input from exams, but really less reliance on enforcement to set the policy. So just a full circle moment for me. Again, this is not a stand down moment, Jamila. It is a refocus moment. And for advisors, I would say the key takeaway would be that even with more targeted enforcement, the fundamentals have not changed. So we're going to stress documentation, supervision, and most importantly, how advisors are treating their clients under their fiduciary duty. All of these are still very much under the microscope.
That was a wonderful overview. And thank you so much, Gil, for just kind of walking us through the complete thought process on where we were, where we're going, and also the differences in the past administration and kind of where we are today. I love that you said less regulation by enforcement, and you used a word I wasn't expecting, less experimentation. I wanted to dig a little bit there, and I think it's related to what you were talking about with taking theory and trying to apply it to an advisor's situation and then maybe moving to enforcement. But would love for you to just pull that thread a little bit on when we say less experimentation, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, and I'm really thinking of sort of novel theories like the presumption that all crypto assets are securities, and then having enforcement be the mechanism for creating for regulating a developing market, rather than going back to the policy divisions and thinking through what is the right framework to think about these new issues. I'm thinking, as I said, about shadow insider trading. If you're trading on trading securities in an issuer that is related to, but not the issuer of on which or for which you have inside information, we will see less of that, and definitely the off-channel communications cases, which came a little bit out of the blue for people and then became the thing. We're hopefully going to see less of that. Where I think that the commission is going to want to look at the existing legal framework, find a clear violation, and then proceed.
Those are great examples, Gail. And to your point on crypto and the recent actions we've seen with the SEC and the CFTC coming together and creating some of a framework and reorganizing how we thought about certain categories of crypto into commodities versus securities, really starting to, like you say, step back and establish a policy and a rule of law about how we think about these type of investments. I'm sure we'll see more from that kind of first big step with aligning together and going forward. So I think this was a great way to think about enforcement for all those that may have been wondering kind of where are we, where we're headed. Matt, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, that was a wonderful summary. I guess I find myself wondering if the fiscal year 2025 results sort of signal also that self-reporting and meaningful cooperation and remediation can materially affect outcomes, and whether we are ultimately referred to enforcement or at least result in reduced penalties in some instances. So
yeah, Matt, I would respond to that, I think definitely remediation is going to be helpful in almost all cases. I think that similar thinking needs to go into whether or not to self-report. That should be a facts and circumstances, and often in consultation with counsel, whether or not it makes sense to self-report. But this commission is definitely looking to firms to remediate themselves, and then preferably not to punish the firms that have remediated. So I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Great conversation points. And just so we keep it rolling, I'm going to move forward to everybody's favorite topic. And before we launch into artificial intelligence, we'll have a polling question. So are you testing or validating AI tools for bias, hallucinations, or false positives? A yes, B no, or C NA. So we'll let folks answer that and we'll keep the conversation going. And Med, I'd love you to tell us, what you're thinking around artificial intelligence. We know you have an opinion because everybody does. What you're seeing, what clients are asking about, what we're doing at Comply, all the things, and what you think the regulatory expectations are going to be and how they might evolve.
Yeah, thank you, Jamila. Yeah, so artificial intelligence is at this point already embedded in core operations and even compliance functions across so many firms. And while there is no AI specific rule, and we know that there was an attempt to propose under Gensler that was rolled back, but even that rule didn't cover all the risks, as we know. But even in the absence of a rule, we know that the SEC's expectation, and that's across speeches, exams, enforcement, is transparency, accountability under existing fiduciary and compliance frameworks. I think one of the biggest risks, unfortunately, is using AI without governance, without controls. And I think that's a current reality for many, many firms. Now, Comply conducted a survey back last fall, 2025. A lot can change in 6 months, certainly in the AI world, but one of the things that came out of that, and that poll included approximately 600 compliance professionals, mostly in the US, some in the UK. And of those polled at that time, 69% responded that they had adopted AI tools into their operations or compliance functions, and less than 50% at that time that had implemented or rolled out AI tools had adopted governance structures, policies, or guardrails. So firms are adopting AI faster than they're building control frameworks around them. So that's, I think, probably one of the more troubling things. Now, again, 6 months has gone by since then. I'm hoping that firms are catching up with that. So if you think about the SEC's approach under the existing framework, in the absence of a rule, and they're adamant that no rule is needed, we have the fiduciary duty. So you consider duty of care. In this context, we want to make sure that all AI outputs are reasonable, that they're in the client's best interest. You can't, as an advisor, outsource your judgment to a model. For duty of loyalty, we're looking at identifying and then disclosing conflicts of interest that may be embedded in AI tools or how we are using those tools. So those, I think, are the primary tools that the SEC will use, both in examinations and enforcement, to address AI, this lack of governance, or any issues that may arise at firms for the foreseeable future. Also, if we think about the fiduciary duty and Section 206 under the Advisors Act, also Rule 206 4-7, the compliance program rule adopted under that, you want to follow that very same process at your firms when dealing with AI deployment, including a risk assessment, asking the proper questions. Where is AI being used? What specific risks arise from that use? using an AI note taker internally to track meetings and takeaways and who's responsible and when are we going to follow up on this item is a much, much lower risk than deploying AI to formulate advice or prioritize investment opportunities or place trades, right? So that's kind of the spectrum that we're looking at here, and firms really need to do their homework to identify the risk, tie those risks specifically to the uses of AI. We've seen in the rapid growth of AI gives me some pause or concern that firms will do this initial analysis and then AI will once again outstrip the controls that they put in place based on the initial risks that were identified as they begin to continue to deploy it in new ways. So this is one of those things that will constantly have to be revisited by firms, conducting that risk assessment tied to specific uses. So anytime there's a new use, a new deployment of AI or a new AI tool brought in, you want to conduct that risk assessment and make sure that you adopt policies, controls, guardrails, guidelines for your staff that specifically address those risks. The other, obviously, is disclosure. I don't see a lot of AI-specific disclosure, for example, being embedded into ADV Part 2 for firms. But I would say if your particular use of AI introduces material risks or conflicts of interest, I think that firms should consider full and fair disclosure regarding those uses, those risks, those conflicts, and how the firm mitigates those risks and conflicts. And then, of course, just the ongoing testing for accuracy, for bias, and making sure that there's validation, review by some qualified, trained human being in the loop there. So those are my initial thoughts on AI, and I could go on if you'd like me to.
No, that's a great, kind of grounding for us. So much here, but the thing that I'm thinking about most is, does this change the way we look at third-party risk in any way? Because a lot of these firms are not building homegrown AI technology. Advisors are buying the biggest, the best, that's the right size fit for them, doing the testing they know to do, right? Based on maybe their own personal use of AI. They may not have an expert in-house that knows how to test whether this is working properly. And then exactly what you said, they have to figure out when is the time to test this again to ensure it hasn't out control the control environment we put in place, right? So how are you thinking about third-party risk? Any changes to the way people deploy their current vendor risk program, vendor risk management program, any heightened risk from a due diligence perspective when you're deploying AI, or is it more of the follow the current fiduciary duty standard and then do your best? Kind of what do you think about when you think about how we should view third-party risk?
Yes and yes. I think the current fiduciary standard would require that, based on the risk, that our approach changes and evolves, right? So I think I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, certainly we're talking about our vendor due diligence. If we're looking at a vendor that is providing an AI tool or providing a functionality that has embedded AI capabilities, then we need to be asking all of those appropriate questions around the development bias. What about this information? What happens to all the information that I input here? And I know a lot of firms have begun experimentation through enterprise licenses with some of the larger AI-specific vendors and tools. But really mapping your data, having an understanding of what happens to your data once it's entered, what access rights the tool has to files within your system is another. Another is even just looking at our vendors that may not be specifically AI or have AI embedded in them, and understanding what sort of sub-vendors they use that may have AI tools and whether those AI tools have access to your information and what happens to that information once it's out of your hands and in the vendor's hands. So really robust due diligence around this. And look, we need to be able to explain. We need to have some explainability around AI, the tools that we use, but I sort of liken this to to driving a car. You need to show the officer how you drove that car in a safe manner. You operated it in a safe manner, but you don't necessarily have to explain how the engine runs. So I think not necessarily having technical transparency, but some sort of functional transparency around the tools that you've adopted and that you are using to serve your clients is a requirement under the fiduciary duty.
Love the car analogy, Med. Also like that you highlighted fourth party risk, because that is going to be something that I do think folks should consider, right? Now that everybody's got their hands on AI, what is not just the third party, but the fourth party risk to you deploying these type of tools. Gail, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. The first is that where we're hearing a lot of questions from our members, and I'm sure you're hearing the same thing, is around these note takers, transcripts, whether or not prompts need to be retained. I think those are hard questions, and we're pleased to hear, it's not official, but we think that relooking at the record keeping rule, partly because of AI, partly because of the off-channel cases, but we think we're going to see that on the SEC's agenda. We think the SEC is going to be working on it, and we'll try to address these questions. The challenge is how you update a rule to make sense and still be future-proof, right? So that it doesn't ask for more than it needs. It doesn't make you keep more than you have to keep. It doesn't sort of increase litigation risk unnecessarily, but it still meets the SEC's policy goals of giving exams what it needs to be able to see. But that's an area where we're getting a ton of questions. The other point I'd make is that this SEC is not just comfortable with innovation and AI, it is affirmatively promoting use of AI, both internally at the SEC and among advisors, which is very interesting. The technology, as Med said, is developing way faster than governance frameworks or than regulatory frameworks can deal with it. So these are some really big challenges. We at the IAA have set up an AI working group. We have calls at least once a month, sometimes more frequently, and we've never had fewer than 100 people on each call. So these are very live issues. Folks are grappling with them, and they keep on becoming more complicated.
Yeah, a couple quick responses to that, Gail. Thank you. Very interesting. I was not aware that the SEC might be looking at the AI note takers and the record keeping. I think in the interim, what we have heard people say is, look, if this note taker is not creating a record that will be wholly or partially client facing in any way, put into some sort of client communication, then it's probably not a required record. I tend to push back on that because I think it's very content specific. If you have a wholly internal conversation around that involves the investment committee and it's around a particular investment choice and what the basis was for a recommendation or why you're going to vote proxies in a certain way, that directly implicates books and records requirements under Rule 204. So I think it's right now, at least, barring new guidance from the SEC, a very facts and circumstances case, whether those are required records. The other thing is, I think it was in February, the current director of the Division Investment Management expressly offered to the industry engagement around AI and how that could be, how tools could be implemented in a way that is that safeguards the best interests of investors. So I think that was very refreshing coming from Brian Daly. So.
It's a great point to kind of end on that. Again, this is not something that you should be worried that the SEC is going to come in and wonder why you're doing it, but they are understandably embracing it and expecting to see it. So it's about having your story around governance and what you're doing and due diligence and using these tools to do better compliance and risk management. So thank you, Med, for that. Sorry, were we going to add something else there?
Yeah, just quickly, I think there is a history around the reluctance, right? And
Hmm.
Brian Daly in that speech specifically mentioned anytime there's a new technology that's sort of introduced into the industry, algorithmic trading, for example, there is sometimes a flurry of enforcement activity, and that has left the industry a little bit reluctant to just jump on the bandwagon. So I think that was the whole point of his speech, as I understood it, was to try to counter that reluctance.
Couldn't agree more. And I continue to see him in other spaces because he's been speaking a lot. He's on the speaking circuit talking about this very issue. So, great point to make, Med. So just to move us on, so we make sure we stay on time. Reg SP, I'm going to start with the polling question, and then I'll key up Gail to take us away. So have you conducted a tabletop exercise to test your breach notification process? A, yes. B, no. C, NA. And we'll let you all submit your answers, and I'll have Gail move forward with telling us a little bit more about where we are with the Reg SP. We're getting close, right, Gail?
Yes, well, we've dipped one leg in, I'd say. SP
Right.
has gone into effect, right, in December
Right,
for
exactly.
what they call the larger firms, which is 1.5 billion in AUM or more, and for everybody else, it's going to go into effect on June 3rd. So I'm going to build on the questions, on the polling questions, by focusing on sort of what's actually changed, what does the rule expect you to do, what should firms be doing right now. So what has changed? Firms now need a formal incident response program, not just policies, but you have to have the ability to detect, assess, contain, and respond to incidents in more or less in real time. And this means that you have to operationalize your incident response plan, not just sort of have it sitting on the shelf. There's also now a mandatory breach notification requirement for customers or clients, if we're talking about advisors. And this is triggered by unauthorized access to sensitive customer information or the likelihood that sensitive customer information was accessed. Notice is required within 30 days of becoming aware of that breach. And we're seeing, and this goes back to the third-party risk vendor issue, we're seeing a significant expansion in expectations around vendor oversight. And this includes an expectation that you will have policies and procedures reasonably designed to ensure that your service providers will give you notice within 72 hours of a breach of their systems that store customer information, not even sensitive customer information. The SEC will expect firms to understand what data they have, where it is, and what is sensitive. And then, of course, there's record keeping. Firms will have to document their incidents, their investigations, and very importantly, their judgments and decisions. So in practice, this has required firms to build out data mapping, incident response playbooks, vendor frameworks, and it's a very meaningful and significant infrastructure lift. We had pushed pretty hard to try to get an extension when this administration came in. One of the first things that they did under acting chair Ueda was to issue some extensions for rules for some recently adopted rules, and for some reason just would not issue an extension for SP, even though it was such a lift for people to get ready. And they've also begun exams right out of the gate. This was one of the few, if not perhaps the only, I don't want to say the only without confirming, but one of the very few rules under the Gensler administration that was unanimously adopted. And so we can understand that there was some reluctance to issue extensions. And of course, people at the SEC and everywhere are very concerned about a big data breach and not, being sort of thought to have been asleep at the wheel. So these have gone into effect, are going into effect, and what we're hearing from our members, the biggest implementation challenges are around these gray areas. The rule is very clear at a high level, and some elements of it are very clear, but there are some key points where it's not entirely clear what you need to do and what the triggers are. So, for example, the notification trigger. When does an incident become reasonably likely to, for a system to have been accessed or information to have been accessed? When does it, when do you become aware that it involves sensitive customer data? What does it mean to cause substantial harm or inconvenience? Those things are really there's a lot of judgment involved there, and these terms aren't clearly defined. And so firms are really having to make these judgment calls in real time. I would say that vendor oversight may be the biggest challenge here. In particular, we're hearing concerns around the 72-hour notification requirement that the SEC expects from service providers. And this, of course, is even before it's determined whether or not the information is sensitive. Firms are dealing with vendor pushback, contract limitations, and limited transparency into their vendors, and really struggling with what if you can't get vendors to commit to giving you 72 hours, to giving you notice within 72 hours, and what if they say they're going to, but then they don't? Like when will the SEC sort of come and issue a deficiency or worse, an enforcement action? Because at the end of the day, the advisor is still responsible. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But exams have started, as I said. So what are we seeing so far? The SEC is approaching this in a pretty structured way, and it's really diving deeply into the technology. It wants to see your risk assessment. It wants to see, what documentation you have. It's doing interviews. It's really looking at testing and thinking about sort of doing its own sort of reality checks, but in detail. They're looking at, does your program actually work? So not just policies, but how are you operationalizing your incident response plans? What are your monitoring tools? And how are you evidencing detection and response? Documentation is obviously a big one here. Staff are wanting to see what data was involved, how decisions were made, and why you've made the judgment that notification was or wasn't required. So it's more than just, show me your policy. It's really show me your process and then show me how the process works. Going back a little bit to vendor oversight, I think that exams, what we've heard is that they're looking at what kinds of terms you've managed to agree to with your vendors, not necessarily via contract, service level agreements there. Do you have certifications? What are you doing to get to a reasonable assurance that you're going to get notification? What due diligence are you doing? How are you monitoring your vendors to make sure that nothing's falling through the cracks? And, what else are you doing to meet your own notification expectations? Firms should be able to demonstrate their data inventories and how they got there, their risk assessments, and they need to show that they understand their data flows and who has what. We haven't yet seen observations come out of the exams division, and we were hoping, but I think it was probably a little way too optimistic, not a little, that we would get something like a risk alert before the June deadline for the sort of second batch of compliance. I think it's unrealistic to expect that. It'll take a while for exams to put its observations together, but at some point we will see a risk alert come out with what they're seeing, where they think the deficiencies are. And I think the deficiencies that we'll see early will be around, you didn't even know there was a rule amendment, right? Like, have you been asleep at the wheel? But they'll also be around whether or not your policies are going to be deemed to be reasonably designed, whether you have okay policies, but you may not be following them properly. Or in some cases, you don't have policies at all. So, it is early days. From our perspective, I just, kind of want to end with this maybe. We have been actively engaging with SEC staff on some of what we understand from our members are the hardest issues. And this includes the 72-hour vendor notification requirement. And also, when does the duty to notify customers, when is it actually triggered? Like, when do you become aware of a breach or a reasonably likelihood of a breach? We are continuing to work with them. We think that in these two areas, guidance, some kind of relief, right? Whether it's a no action position or guidance, would be enormously helpful for advisors. This SEC and the investment management staff are quite open to talking to us about guidance, but we've been pressing them now for several months to get something out quickly. We're we're working through it with them. The staff really has some bandwidth issues. We talked at the beginning about loss of staff across the board at the SEC. Investment management has lost the most in terms of percentage of all the divisions. It's, I think, 23 or 24%. It's high. So a lot of expertise has gone away, and a lot of people have gone away. But Daly in particular has talked about being open for business in terms of engagement and really wanting to listen. So we are taking him up on that, and we're really trying to get guidance, and hopefully we'll get some relief around the 70, what it means to have policies that are reasonably designed to ensure the 72-hour notification. So I'd say that's, those are the high points or low points, depending on how you look at it, of Reg SP. Again, documentation, monitoring, be ready for production. These are going to be critically important.
I think you highlighted the main things that people are still wondering. What is going to be the judgment call on notification? Prior to this, you have a level of judgment inside your own firm. So there's this idea that I want to remediate. I kind of want to know how bad this is before I start ringing alarm bells, right? And you had a little bit of leverage on other issues before you started notifying clients, definitely from our perspective. So it's trying to figure out, like you said, how to engage with the SEC. I love that they're open to hear and talk to folks. Vendors, most vendors that we are aware of and obviously comply, we are submitting to this. We are absolutely going to make sure our clients can rely on us to be responsive in that time frame. But we recognize that it's going to be, depending on the issue, it's going to be an experience, right? So I do think we'll try to get more, like you said, from the commission on this. I'd love a risk alert. You hit it, Gail. So hopefully, if somebody's listening and watching this, they say, okay, we heard it from Gail, we heard it from Jamila, Med nodded, and we get something more around timing, because that's going to be the criticality. Folks like us, we've been in the industry for a long time. Remember when BCPs, business continuity plans, were big time tested. As an examiner, like going to a firm and being like, let me see the hot site, cold site, let's run the plays. This is a little bit different in that it's data and it's systems, and there's nowhere to go, and there's not a, off-site place I got to go and look at boxes on shelves, right, Gail? But it's even more important. And to your point about expectations, I think you don't have to go anywhere, but you got to get the right vendors, and you got to have the right oversight. You got to stay on top of it, because it's more risky now that this is not physical in the way that it was before, but it's data that can be really just taken away in a blink of an eye with a quick attack or breach. So I am happy we have this. I do think you're right, Gail. This is something that all the commissioners agreed on because they recognize the risk, right? And they don't want to have a fallout. But interested to see how compliant firms can be given that very short period of time to notify clients. I don't know, Med, anything you want to add?
I think, I've witnessed firms sort of struggle with this issue. I would love to see some guidance. My thought is the standard imposed on investment advisors is reasonableness, that their policies be reasonably designed to address the risk, to address the regulation. And as long as they have done that and have discharged their duties under those policies, are, running those policies appropriately, then we should be fine. And that's a big should, right? I don't know. But the SEC does not regulate these third-party vendors, and it seems to me that this SEC potentially comes dangerously close to being susceptible to some of the criticism that was levied against the last administration under some of the rules that had previously been withdrawn. That the SEC is not the regulator of custodians, or some of the criticism that we saw under the safeguarding rule, or the cybersecurity rule. So I'm hopeful that we get that guidance, because I don't think that's a position that this SEC wants to be in. And then one observation that I would make, and maybe a caution to the industry: some of the very large firms that we work with, a few of them had reached out to all of their vendors again and asked for refreshed vendor due diligence under this amended Reg SP, and they got reams and reams and reams of documentation. So now they're sitting on reams and reams of documentation, and someone needs to go through that and find the necessary information. Now, look, maybe AI can help with that, but in the interim, we know that sort of creates some risk in and of itself. So when submitting these requests to vendor due diligence, I think we want to be very specific around what we're looking for. Are there written policies and procedures that you will adopt that will require this notification within 72 hours? Can you show me the escalation methodology? What are the handoffs? Are there timeframes linked to specific reviews and things? And that is going to make the advisor's job so much easier. Just sort of lessons learned from round one that I wanted to share there with the audience.
That is a great point, and you're spot on. Reams and reams of data, paper, for lack of a better word. You're right, and getting specific on answering the call for Reg SP versus trying to solve for other issues like vendor due diligence, third-party risk management in this exercise. All right, well, Med, thank you. Thank you, Gail, for giving us some insights on Reg SP. Our final topic is the marketing rule, and I'll start with a polling question. So given the December 2025 risk alert, have you increased or enhanced documentation for marketing materials review? A, yes, B, no, or C, NA? And Med, this is one of the topics where we are getting some risk alerts and we are getting constant engagement since this new but not so new rule came out. And so I'd love to hear your views on the latest and greatest of what we've gotten from the commission and any changes in the ways firms should be thinking about the differences in what was highlighted in the risk alert.
Yeah, so I guess I would start initially, thank you, Jamila, with noting that advertising by investment advisors has been a perennial issue, if we want to call it that, or regulatory risk area for almost a century, really. I mean, it was misleading investment promotions and statements, that really led to getting us the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. So this area has a really long history. And in fact, that designation 2064-1 for the rule is a signifier that it was top priority number one under the anti-fraud provision of that act to adopt a rule. And that long-standing rule was obviously recently replaced in 2022 with the modernized marketing rule that we deal with today, which consolidated, of course, that original longstanding advertising rule and the cash solicitation rule, but it introduced some new concepts, or at least consolidated a lot of concepts that were in a lot of other documentation, no action letters and position papers and enforcement actions around testimonials and endorsements in that framework, and requirements, third-party ratings requirements, and I think critically the general prohibitions, which includes this explicit substantiation standard now that I think is a really, I don't want to say it was underestimated when the rule was first adopted, but has become quite the lever for the SEC. And I think we've seen that in the latest risk alert. I think you're right. We've had 4 risk alerts since adoption of the rule in 2022. First one was really like, hey, we're coming. Hope you understand the rule. Hope you've adopted some policies. And we've steadily moved on and kind of picked up and focused on various areas. And the latest one was December 2025. So I think that is most indicative of what we may see in terms of trends or what's coming in 2026 and beyond. And one of the first things, just major themes, is a misclassification, a failure to recognize that certain arrangements were testimonials or endorsements that had to abide by the rule. And I think it's funny because I remember and think back to, by way of analogy, the custody rule. This is a little more than a decade ago, 2013. There was a risk alert that came out where staff identified failure to recognize the advisor had custody as a core deficiency, with I think it was 1/3 or 2/3 of advisors that were examined fell victim to that. And then in 2014, that was reinforced. Again, the same finding that you didn't recognize that you had custody. And the same sort of principle applies here under this risk alert, under the new marketing rule. You can't comply with a rule if you don't recognize that it applies. So I think that's one major theme that we saw. Some of these are, kind of ticking down the list of what the requirements are and just finding failures with respect to disclosures, that they're not clear and prominent when required in the context of disclosures around testimonials and endorsements, using smaller font, using a grayed out font, using hyperlinks to bury some of those disclosures. Failing to include compensation details, failing to provide details around conflicts of interest and so forth. So that's one major theme. The other is just oversight failures. Again, we're sort of ticking down the requirements of the rule, having no written agreements in place, and again, no monitoring of activity of promoters, no reasonable basis for believing that the promoter complied with the delivery of required disclosures and so forth. So all of that, or much of that, also goes back to some of these specific circumstances of not recognizing that the rule applies. So at this point, I think the SEC is not sympathetic to that any longer. We're years into this rule. And if it was the first risk alert, I don't know that we would have necessarily seen that, because we had a much softer tone. We've moved on from that at this point. We're also seeing documentation failures that came up in that 2025 risk alert. Firms that could not produce substantiation of material claims, approval records, supporting materials around performance. So I think substantiation is emerging as kind of a centerpiece of the SEC's focus around the marketing rule, likely to be a focus in 2025. And just to refresh your memories, the rule requires that firms have a reasonable basis to substantiate material claims at the time they are made in advertising. So the burden of proof is on the advisor, not the SEC. The SEC does not have to prove that a material claim is false or misleading. And I think where firms are getting this wrong is they're trying to later reconstruct this substantiation when they're requested, and that's the wrong approach. We need to have this substantiation in place contemporaneously with the development of the marketing materials and before it is then disseminated. Another area where we're seeing some issues is that, my staff of consultants have highlighted this on a few occasions, where they will test substantiation and go back to the firm and say, so you claim X, and you point to this as your substantiation. This does not stand for that proposition at all. So I don't know who read this. So we want to be very careful to make sure that our substantiating documentation actually stands for and supports the material claim that we're including in marketing materials. And this actually was in the risk alert, and I think we've seen it in recent cases where there's been inconsistent support across channels for the same claims made across channels, where the supporting evidence either differs or the claim is only substantiated in some context but not others, and they've kind of expanded the claim on the website or some other tear sheet, and did not go back and update the substantiating documentation. So that's another area. So the substantiation really has to be claim specific, and firms need to be careful about that. One thing that I typically recommend in this area for firms is to create a substantiation tracking matrix, which is just a simple grid, the way that I envision it, which repeats the claim, which materials that claim appears in, what substantiation or support the firm has for that claim, where that substantiating documentation can be found. And then I also recommend typically that there be some kind of expiry date on that, depending on the context, depending on what the claim is, because the claim might be material at the time, it might grow stale. The other thing with substantiation, and then I'll kind of pause for a little bit because I know I've been rambling, is this complication that AI adds. It introduces a new substantiation, I think, risk layer, because AI can generate claims that sound super credible, but are maybe not factually supported. We know that AI can hallucinate. We also know that AI can be bullied into coming to the conclusion that you've gone round and round and wanted it to get to sometimes. So, it can exaggerate differentiation, include implications. So I think that adds another layer of risk, and we want to be very, very careful. AI can be super helpful in creating copy or creating material that can be included in marketing. But if there are material claims, we want to make sure that we have a human being that reviews, that validates those claims, and produces the supporting information and keeps that in the firm's records.
This was a great overview on substantiation. I agree with you, Med. This is the thing that most people focus on, and I don't think we were saying the word substantiation nearly as much before November 2022. We were talking about it thematically, but you're right, everybody's focused on this, and in a way that is necessary to keep up with the technology developments. Like you said, there are firms that can kind of automate disclosure reviews and amendments via AI. Are you comfortable letting AI do that based on, what it's gathering from the industry? And do you need really to have every time a legal review, a compliance review? How are you really thinking about infusing not just the creation of materials from an AI perspective, but all of the governance and the disclosure framework? That would certainly save time, but is it the right use of AI right now? So I think we're really in the middle of what we'll see more of, which is a development of marketing being scaled to faster to clients, faster to prospects, but hopefully with well-governed principles around it. Gail, anything you want to add from a marketing perspective? And I know we'll have to kind of round out the conversation soon.
Yeah, no, I think Med, you did an excellent job, and I actually got some great insights from you, so thank you.
Of course.
Well, with that, I'll kind of round it out and give our last polling question, which really hits on what focus areas are most important for you as you've been listening to our discussion. If you had an SEC examination next quarter, which of these three areas would require the most immediate remediation? Is it A, artificial intelligence compliance? Is it B, Reg SP implementation? Or is it C, marketing rule compliance? So we'll let those answers come in, and I'll really just round it out with some final comments from Gail and Med on what compliance leaders should be doing now. I mean, Gail, we'll start with you. What do you think is the single most important thing that our compliance leaders should be thinking about and doing right now?
I'd say to really pay attention to what the SEC is saying about its exam and enforcement priorities. You have to focus on the areas that the SEC has prioritized, and those will always include fiduciary duty and conflicts, always include, as Med alluded to, marketing, data privacy and cybersecurity, always include custody, and then I'd say use and controls around emerging technology. That's where your focus, you should be looking at your programs holistically, but focusing on where the SEC is prioritizing, because it's trying to get its messages out publicly, and then it sort of means what it says.
Great. Med, what about you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You definitely want to focus where your regulator is focused, certainly, but and just in any area that is an emerging risk area, if it's applicable to your firm. So that risk analysis, I would say, if you are going to deploy AI in any way in your firm, you want to build out and maintain that AI inventory, and I would make that a priority at your firms.
Thank you, Med, and thank you, Gail, for such a robust, dynamic conversation. I say this every time, but I can't wait till part 2 when we discuss where things have gone with the enforcement agenda and beyond. Before we wrap up, I want to do a quick overview of some upcoming events. We have the CMO and CCO Guide to Marketable Compliance for growth-focused teams. That webinar is on April 23rd, so please join us for that. And then a Demystifying Books and Records in the Age of AI, very related to what we just talked about. Please watch that on demand and let us know what you think about that webinar. We have a couple of more events in the city of New York. We'll be there on April 30th for a CCO exchange with some of our enterprise CCO leaders. And then we'll be attending the FINRA conference in Washington, D.C. on May 12th through the 14th. Continuing education, we had a little bit of an overview of this from Pat, who kicked off our webinar, but I just want to remind folks that we have the IACCP and IA Core programs. Together, the IAA and Comply sponsor these programs, and we're happy to share more at any time. Reach out to us about why we believe these are such great educational opportunities for new CCOs and seasoned CCOs alike. And then finally, join us in Nashville, November 8th through the 11th for Comply Connect 2026. We hope to see you there. We are looking forward to having a great time in Music City with all of our favorite folks, our stakeholders, folks from the IAA, folks from Comply, obviously, as well as a lot of our friends of the industry. So please join us for some great CPE sessions, as well as a lot of fun around compliance and risk management. And with that, I'll bid you adieu. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the next Comply webinar.
Thanks, everyone, for the discussion today. We appreciate your time. We'll follow up with the recording and additional materials. And I'll leave you with one thing. The firms that are best prepared are the ones that can show, not just say, that their compliance program works. Again, thank you for joining us today.